Hi, I'm delighted to welcome you to the final event in the inaugural year of the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center. I'm Ian Miller, co-convener of the forum, together with Professor Robin Kelsey, who's Dean of Arts and Humanities here in the second row here. I know that I speak for Robin when I thank all of you for joining us this evening, for making time in Reading Week. We're heading into exams, we're grading, we're writing, we're thinking about what we haven't got done and what we have to do in the summer, and it is especially heartening to see so many folks here for tonight's talk. I also want to begin, as I always do, by thanking Homi Baba, director of the Mahindra Center, as well as the remarkable staff at the center. It's an incredible group who go above and beyond each and every event. There's never a hitch in these, and we've done several of them. They're very complicated in all sorts of intricate ways, and so I wanted to begin by recognizing the staff, in particular Steve Beal, who's here, and Sarah Razor, who could not join us this evening, but who we're thinking about tonight. So thank you all very much. Tonight's speaker is Professor Tiya Miles. She may be the final speaker of the series, but she was one of the first people that we thought about when we put our heads together and started scheming about the Environment Forum. What should this thing look like? Who should we invite? What are the issues? And so on. And I'm so pleased that you could be here this evening, Tiya. Thank you for making your way out from the Midwest and for joining us back here in Boston. Professor Miles' work really needs little introduction for many of you, but I can't resist, so I'm going to do the ritual introduction because it's so good and so rich. She's Mary Henrietta Graham Distinguished University Professor, along with several other ancillary professorships at the University of Michigan, and the author of numerous works that each seem to burst the confines of some kind of orthodoxy, some kind of thinking that constrains our thought. Shaking free of the hard line between Native American histories and those of African Americans, for example, in 2005's Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and in freedom, or books that vault over the walls that seem to separate fiction from nonfiction, as in 2015's the most recent work, The Cherokee Rose, a novel of gardens and ghosts. And it's a great read. Pick it up. Cherokee Rose was a Publisher's Weekly Pick of the Week. And it was also, and this is my favorite of the many and ample accolades on Professor Miles, she has a CV that is about 25 pages long, and it's not padded. It is a rich collection of accomplishments, but this was my personal favorite. Cherokee Rose was selected as, quote, a book that all Georgians should read, unquote, by the Georgia Center for the Book. I think all the Cantabrigians here need to join in that crowd as well. It's a fantastic work. Professor Miles' CV stretches on for yards, and we could be here until the cows come home if I were to explore its heights. I imagine, and I must invoke it, that it's her MacArthur Fellowship that garners the most attention when she visits places to give talks and discussions. But as remarkable and richly deserved as that accomplishment is, it isn't what led us to think about Professor Miles for the Environment Forum. She's a perfect fit for what we're trying to do here, the ways we're trying to think. It was instead a small note on her CV in some ways, but a really significant and meaningful accomplishment. The fact that this hugely accomplished historian is providing young girls with opportunities to engage with the natural world in new ways, to think about it creatively, and to put ideas of environmental justice to work through an organization that she founded in 2011 called Eco Girls. Google it. A number of you have your machines open. Pick it up. Check it out. environmentforgirls.com. It's really an inspiration for what we could all do to bridge outside of the academy and into everyday life. And it's an organization whose mission and importance was in some ways prescient and perhaps, well, certainly underlined by recent events in Flint, Michigan. This work, combined with the fact that much of Professor Miles' work, from parts of the Ties That Bind and certainly the novel Cherokee Rose to her other major monograph, the award-winning The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story, is deeply and carefully located in place, in environments. Now there are other questions that we could ask of those works, and it's not their main concern, but there's a consciousness and an awareness there that runs through, and at least to my eye, over the course of Professor Miles' writing career, begins to move more and more to the center of consideration. Perhaps that's thanks in part to her time as a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellow, where she focused on becoming an expert in the field of environmental history during a year-long sojourn at Montana State University, home to the previous speaker in the forum, Timothy LaCain, and others in the field. Each of these books realizes one of the main goals that we have here at the forum. It's a pretty simple one in some ways. It's not to segregate the field out in some way, to craft a notion of environmental humanities, or to reinforce the practice of environmental history as a subfield, but rather to break out of those confines. And to paraphrase Levi-Strauss, I can't help it, I write about animals. He likes to think animals, think with them. Really to think with the environment in our work as humanists, historians, artists, and others. We are, to paraphrase one of my undergraduates who's not here, she's writing her paper, which is due in 24 hours, so I can cite her without her becoming bashful, to be environmentally honest. This is her theme in our work as humanists and historians. That is, to consider how thinking with the natural world might help us to rethink our practice as intellectuals, as artists, as citizens, to perform that most difficult trick of academic magic, to ask new questions. With that rather lengthy introduction, please join me in welcoming Professor Tiya Miles back to Harvard, her alma mater.
That was very touching. Thank you, Ian. And thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I know it's a very busy time for you. Please do me the favor of letting me know if at some point you can't hear me in the back. Okay. So I was very pleased to learn just now that Tim LaCain was here speaking in this series, because when I was at Montana State trying to learn about environmental history, I took a class with him. And this was an amazing luxury to be a faculty member, but to go and kind of hide out and pretend to be a graduate student and to sit there and listen and discuss in a different kind of way. And one thing I learned in that class is that environmental history was not at all what I thought it was, and that I definitely was not doing it and really couldn't yet imagine how to do it. What tended to get me kind of stuck in that class were finding pages in the readings that were all about science. I mean, really deeply into the science. I'd find myself kind of losing focus after page 5 of exactly how the tobacco plant grows. But I appreciated that experience, and it's what's led me to think about what I'm going to share with you today. This is new work, and I am very grateful for the invitation that Ian extended to get a chance to actually start to formulate some of these ideas. Some of you may know that the title of my talk comes from a poem by Langston Hughes, and it's a poem called I've Known Rivers. This poem is familiar to some of us, I think, from our high school or college classrooms. That's where I first read it, and it was written by Hughes in the early part of his professional career. I'm going to read it for you now. It's not very long, but it is beautiful. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. The literary critic Arnold Rampersad has described this poem as exploring themes of death and eternal spiritual life in a symbolic world in which the river represents the Black race as a maternal, primal source. When I first encountered the poem many years ago, I was focused on Hughes's lyricism and the tug I felt toward an Afrocentric aesthetic upon encountering his words. I felt a sense of an age-old Black diasporic culture that felt misty with the weight of time. But I didn't dwell much on the rivers themselves. I didn't think about these rivers conjured by the poet as physical, material entities with histories and ecologies of their own. The rivers claimed by Hughes's narrator faded into the far reaches of my awareness, even as I was being invited to know them. So my fairly inattentive focus on natural features in this poem echoed my lived experience of growing up near a critically important waterway, the Ohio River. I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. This was the majestic river town once known as the Queen City of the West. It's a place whose name means beautiful river in Iroquois. And it's a place that left its mark on me. When I was very young, I contracted an infection, which is caused by fungal spores that are partial to the Ohio River Valley. And this infection destroyed much of my retina, causing near blindness in my left eye. And then as an older child, I saw the Ohio River freeze. It froze 12 inches deep, which was a rare occurrence in the 20th century. In January of '77, the month that I turned 7 years old, Cincinnati saw its second coldest winter on record. Among a stretch of 28 days below zero, the low reached minus 25 degrees. According to hydrologist Julie Reed, this extreme cold, coupled with a low flow, is what resulted in such a thick freeze. '77 and '78 were 2 years among the 14 times out of 126 winters on record that the Ohio River froze. These are some photographs of that freeze, and over the Easter holiday, I went home and asked my dad if he could dig out some of the pictures showing when he took me and my little sister to walk on the river. That's us on the right-hand side. And when I saw the photographs that he dug out, I was shocked. That's Kentucky. We were so far out on the river. My father is crazy, but in a good way. And that's not my dad, by the way. That's someone who my father said was taking our picture because he was shocked that we were out so far. To this day, I don't think that any of the mothers or grandmothers in our family knew he was going to do that. But he wanted us to have an experience that might be the last one we might have. And it seems that he was right about that. When I was doing research trying to find old pictures about this moment, I came across an article that talked about, quote, the old timers who can still remember when the Ohio River froze. And I realized that I'm in that group because I kind of remember. I was seven. I'm in the red coat. My sister's 4. She's in the blue coat. And I kind of remember how exhilarating it was, how awestruck we felt, and how we couldn't believe that we were walking across a surface that was normally such a threat and so dangerous. But even though my health had been seriously affected by living near this water, and even though I hadn't walked on it, I never really thought of it as an active presence. I never thought of its physical makeup. I never thought of its capacity for change. I never really reflected on it. And I wouldn't reflect on it until I first read Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, actually here on this campus in a class on Black women's history. In that novel, which many of you have read or will soon read, an enslaved woman who has escaped is haunted by the daughter whose life she has taken to save that daughter, to rescue her from slavery. And crossing the Ohio River is a very important passage in that novel. So I read that novel in a class. Most of it went over my head. I didn't understand it at all. But the Ohio River part, I did get, and it stuck with me. And I felt very fortunate to have lived in a place where I could see that river all the time. I started to get a sense of the importance of the Ohio as a liquid line between the free states and the slave states. And I had the feeling that I had grown up in a place that had taken on mystical connotations in African American abolitionist histories. But that's about as far as I went as a 20-something reader. I still didn't know the river and anything that went beyond a romantic connection. I didn't know the river in any way approaching the focus of Langston Hughes's narrator, and arguably of my enslaved ancestors who hailed from Kentucky on my father's side. So being here with you this evening gives me the opportunity to think about this notion out loud for the first time. The notion of knowing the river as a theme in the history of African American slavery and resistance. What does it mean to know rivers for enslaved Black people and in a broader African American cultural tradition that grew out of this difficult past? Did Black people evidence an environmental consciousness? Is there such a thing as an Afro-ecological perspective? And finally, are there any insights or practices in this history for all of us to hold on to and to examine more closely as we face environmental crises of multiple and great proportions in the 21st century? My route into these questions will be through the terrain of enslavement and escape in the 19th century, and I've selected 2 chapters in that history that have broad cultural salience to think through. The first is the dramatic and highly publicized story of Margaret Garner, a woman seeking her freedom in 1850s Kentucky and Ohio. And the second is the set of folkloric tales tied to Ibo people in the Southeast, who are said to have jumped into the water and flown back to Africa. In examining these chapters with a focus on rivers and waterways, what I treat specifically and also as synecdoche to stand in for nature writ large, I'm trying to gain a sense of Black environmental consciousness that has roots in slavery and later flowers into cross-generational, cultural, and creative life. So I am a scholar of slavery studies and maybe a wannabe environmental historian, but I'm not quite there yet. So you'll hear me struggling in these remarks to render nature as a real, living, and active entity that participates in the contingencies of Black experiences in slavery and the possibilities of escape. You'll see me reaching to draw links between freedom bids and environmental awareness, and implicitly asking the following questions. How does the environment permit or impede fugitivity? And by that I mean both orientation toward escape and practices of flight. How does a state of enslavement necessitate environmental consciousness, and of what kind? What impressions has this environmental attentiveness left on Black cultural expression and political practice? And if you sense an argument behind my words that are to follow, it will be the supposition that enslaved people knew rivers. In imagining and enacting their freedom dreams, they took flight in relation to and in relation with their specific environments. Nature is an actor in the history of slavery and abolition, not just a symbol, not just a backdrop, and not just a setter of mood. First, I'll focus on Margaret Garner's story. Margaret Garner's tragic story comes down to us primarily by way of newspapers from the 1850s that sensationalized her unprecedented trial in a Cincinnati courtroom. Garner was a young African-American woman held as a slave in rural Kentucky and likely sexually abused repeatedly by her owner, Archibald Gaines, since her teenage years. Margaret was permitted to marry, and she partnered with a man named Robert Garner, who was enslaved on a nearby plantation. Margaret had 4 children and was pregnant again by the time she reached the age of 22. These children were the progeny of Margaret and her husband Robert, and also, indicators strongly suggest, of the man who claimed to own her. In the freezing month of January, in the winter of 1856, Margaret and Robert set in motion a hazardous plan engineered by Robert. They aimed to seize their freedom and that of their family. Along with Robert's parents and their 4 young children, the couple approached the frigid banks of the Ohio River with a wagon and 2 horses that Robert had taken from his owner. The river had frozen over that month, permitting the family to walk across it rather than having to find a boat and someone who would captain it. In a documentary titled The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, and yes, there was resonance for us in that title, African American literature and history scholars Henry Louis Gates and Nikki Taylor referred to the Ohio in this instance as, quote, a natural footbridge to freedom. And it was, for a transitory moment in the Garners' lives. But as Taylor and Gates narrate, and as other chroniclers have also detailed, the Garner story, steeped in the tragedy of border state slavery, sinks still further after this remarkable crossing. The Garner family made their way to the home of the Kites, Margaret's 3 cousins who lived by the river. The plan had been for Elijah Kite to find Levi Coffin, an abolitionist living in Cincinnati, who would help him to concoct a plan to move the family on to another safe house. But before they could take these steps, Archibald Gaines, the owner of Margaret Garner, appeared at the home of the Kites with armed officers, surrounded the home, and threatened violence and recapture under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act. What happened next stops the heart of any listener, and also stopped the heart of Margaret's 2-year-old daughter, who was, according to court testimony that would come later, quote, almost white in appearance. Margaret, thrown into a morass of fear and sorrow at the specter of a return to a physical, social, and sexual bondage that her female offspring would inherit, began to assault her daughters and sons. She was seeking, as revealed in later court testimony, to, quote, kill the children. Margaret wanted to rescue those under her care from lives of slavery, and she did so via the only means at her disposal. Before my children shall be taken back to slavery, I will kill them. Before my children shall be taken back to slavery, I will kill every one of them, Margaret said. She took the life of her toddler daughter and injured the other children before being physically restrained. Now, Robert Garner had been firing shots at the slave catchers in defense of his family, only seeing later that the youngest girl had been nearly decapitated by his wife. Officers took the Garner family into custody. The sensational trial, which lasted for 2 weeks, hinged on whether Margaret could be considered a person and hence held accountable for murder and tried for murder, or whether she should be defined as a thing. If she were a thing, then she had merely dispossessed her owner of another one of his things, the child, Mary. The federal commissioner acting as judge, John Pendery, decided that Margaret was a thing. She and her family were returned to Gaines, but she would not be tried for murder, and Gaines promptly shipped them downriver to Arkansas, New Orleans, and Mississippi to protect the value of his property, and also, as scholars Stephen Weisenberger and Nikki Taylor have argued, to protect Southern male honor and white societal honor. During a steamboat accident en route to the Deep South, Margaret lost her infant to the Mississippi River, and this was likely an attempt at both infanticide and suicide, but Margaret was actually saved. 2 years later, Margaret died of typhoid fever, and her husband Robert would go on to fight in the Civil War that the family's deceased daughters would never see the fruits of. This event is unique in its particulars, but representative of collective trials and traumas that slavery inflicted on Black women and families. It has been reimagined and expressed by Black artists in multiple forms because of its power, dating all the way back to the mid-19th century and stretching into our contemporary times. Most recently and significantly, Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, offered an imaginary, revelatory, and painful rendering of the life of Setha, a character modeled by Morrison after Margaret Garner. Morrison's version of the story has been retold in film and rewritten for an opera titled Margaret Garner. In the 19th century, African-American writer and political commentator Frances Ellen Watkins Harper composed a poem inspired by the story. Harper's poem, The Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio, features an enslaved mother fleeing across the river, only to later take her children's lives to save them from what Harper describes as their darkly threatened doom. When Harper penned this interpretation of a slave mother's ravaged emotional state, she posited nature, the river, and the weather as central elements of her telling. Literary scholar Christine Yeoh has noted this, describing, quote, the atmosphere of the poem as a metaphor for, quote, the frigid and barren environment of slavery. The backdrop of winter's chill, she says, permeates the poem. Yeoh's reading is instructive. Harper's poem is indeed coldly bleak and melancholy. But Harper, writing in reaction to this incident soon after it occurred, attends to the environment in layered ways, rendering it not just as a set or a stage, and not just as metaphor, but also as active participant in the unfolding drama. Harper opens her poem by painting a human emotional landscape in which shadows crowd the thoughts of the slave mother. Once this mother decides to run, features of the environment rise as material members of her emotional and arguably social world. Part 2 of Harper's poem, which details the escape, begins with the line, quote, winter and night were on the earth. Harper then foregrounds natural features in her poem, describing Margaret setting out with bright dreams of deliverance for an Ohio River, quote, bridged and spanned with ice. The, quote, shivering trees of Harper's personified landscape feebly moan as Margaret approaches, even as the breeze murmurs and winter itself sighs. These natural entities, together with what Harper describes as the northern star shining bright, stand witness to Margaret's deepest desires and to her daring actions. They feel with her, moan with her, and ultimately deliver her into a shallow respite of liberty. Frances sees the river and its surrounding environs, as did Margaret and her family. The stunning elements of Margaret Garner's story are manifold, as are its miseries. In interpreting it, many of us have long treated the river itself as a stage, as a metaphor, its activated presence and natural ecology fading from our focus. The river was frozen when the Garners crossed, we say, before moving on to the bloody scene of, quote, child murder. But what would we see if we paused at the banks of the river, as the Garners did in their escape, and as Frances Harper did in her poem? Historian Nikki Taylor's new book on Margaret Garner begins to take us down this road. In it, Taylor devotes 2 pages to thinking about the winter weather, and she discusses the peril the family faced in stepping out onto that ice, which she describes as an unnatural walking surface. Taylor writes that, quote, any misstep on a fragile section of the ice could have cracked it, sending some or all of the Garners to an icy death. But this terrible risk seemed worth taking at moments when the river became an ice bridge or a winter bridge, in the words of newspaper articles at the time, which sped the efficiency of transport. attempting to cross in warmer weather carried even greater risk for this family, the risk of failure, the risk of recapture. The Garners, and Robert in particular, knew the river. He understood, as Taylor points out, that January and February presented the best potential for a frozen waterway, and that a frozen waterway presented the best potential for actually making it to freedom. This knowledge, Taylor asserts, was, quote, invaluable to the fugitives. So the Garners fled, and perhaps they would not have done so on that particular night had the weather or water behaved differently. Perhaps the Garners had been planning such an escape for weeks or even years and needed such a natural occurrence to enact it. If so, the Garners were not the only people held in bondage who closely watched the waterways. 9 others also escaped that evening in what the Chicago Tribune newspaper disparagingly called a stampede of slaves. In a separate story recalled by the Ohio-based abolitionist Levi Coffin, a Black woman named Eliza Harris also traversed the Ohio to freedom on that frozen footbridge. Eliza had been enslaved in Kentucky, across the way from Ripley, Ohio, where her owner planned to sell her child due to monetary problems. Coffin writes in his reminiscences, quote, "When she found that it," meaning the child, "was to be taken from her, she was filled with grief and dismay, and resolved to make her escape that night if possible. She watched her opportunity. She started with her child in her arms and walked straight toward the Ohio River. She knew that it was frozen over at that season of the year and hoped to cross without difficulty on the ice," end quote. The harrowing flight of Eliza Harris has been seared into our cultural memory by way of its retelling in Harriet Beecher Stowe's best-selling novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. As Coffin relates, and as Stowe dramatizes, Eliza did not find the river fully frozen as she had hoped and anticipated when she left. Coffin writes, quote, "When she reached its banks at daylight, she found that the ice had broken up and was slowly drifting in large cakes." Coffin details Eliza's calculations as she waits a day, hoping the freeze will harden, even as slave catchers approach her hiding place. She runs toward the thawing river with her child in arms and leaps across the separated chunks of ice, sometimes laying her child on the next berg and stair-stepping this way to safety. Coffin concludes about Eliza's flight, quote, "She felt that surely the Lord was preserving her and upholding her, and that nothing could harm her." This story, as Coffin gives it to us, and later Stowe, and still later Frances Harper, in a poem titled Eliza Harris, highlights the central role of the river's changeability and of Eliza's keen awareness of the river's various forms. Perhaps the Lord played a part in this moving scene of escape, as Coffin describes it. We can't know the answer to that, but we can see in the chronicle of events as narrated that the river joined Eliza and her hunters as an actor in the drama. What the river did mattered to Eliza's choices. It could flow, it might freeze, it could thaw. It could take the life of her or her child or ransom them to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. Eliza chose to ride the river, unsure of its allegiances, concluding that a divine power, perhaps with the authority to direct the changing faces of nature, oversaw all. Indeed, as Frances Harper wrote in her poem about Eliza, quote, "With her step on the ice and her arm on her child, the danger was fearful, the pathway was wild, but aided by heaven, she gained a free shore where the friends of humanity opened their door." I found in actually trying to look at this river that I grew up on for my talk with you tonight that the Ohio River is peculiar. It's the 4th largest river in North America as measured by flow or discharge, and yet it's the only one among the big rivers that does not join directly with an ocean. Instead, the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, contributing 40% of that river's flow before the Mississippi travels to the Atlantic. The Ohio moves east to west in a continental temperate climate marked by moistness in the air in winter as well as summer. Winter temperatures range from a mean of 19.5 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The winters that saw temperatures low enough and long enough to freeze the waterway were unusual, but not fully unpredictable. The Ohio River changes in certain ways and according to certain rhythms. Eliza Harris, the Garners, and other enslaved people held in Kentucky must have been hyper aware of this. And so they crossed in particular weather conditions and at a specific point in the shape of the river's many bends. January 28, 1856, the date of the Garners' escape, was one of the coldest days on record for Kentucky. The river, as a result, froze. The physical attributes and actions of that river became a factor in what followed. In a certain sense, the Ohio River microclimate made the Cincinnati location a hub for slave rebellion. The same perhaps cannot be said for other rivers, such as the Mississippi, where I have yet to hear of recorded ice bridge escapes. If you know of one, please tell me. Mississippi did freeze, but I haven't yet found a story where enslaved people escaped across it. The Garners and all of those who escaped during the frozen winters were part of a riverine ecology, a set of relationships between organisms that linked them to the river in a strong, if invisible, net. Nature could support or impede enslaved people's escape plots. The river became a player in their life dramas, albeit a player that takes no sides. And there may be more that we can draw out from the frozen Ohio beyond these individual stories. What this river did and the ways that people responded may have affected political outcomes as well. Although weather data has only been collected on the river since 1874, we do have a colloquial record of its freezing patterns in the 19th century. Former U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes told Underground Railroad historian Wilbur Siebert in 1893 that in the winters of 1850, 51, 52, 53, 55, and 56, quote, "The river was frozen over and crossing made everywhere practicable near Ripley and Cincinnati," end quote. The hydrology of the Ohio, together with weather patterns, made its transformation into an ice bridge possible, and that possibility, indeed actuality, may have influenced the slow erosion of the slave system. When Hayes listed the years that the river froze, he added a political time marker, noting that these were years, quote, soon after the Fugitive Slave Law had passed. The draconian federal legislation of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 permitted and even mandated the recapture and return of runaway slaves in the free states. This legislation sent shockwaves of fear through Black communities in the North, and the law targeted Black people and white people who were fighting in the abolitionist movement. The actions of runaway slaves in the antebellum era, as the historian Eric Foner has argued, put pressure on the governing system, forcing confrontation between slaveholders and anti-slavery advocates, the South and the North. The freezing of the Ohio River for nearly 5 years straight after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law invited more enslaved people to escape, often in groups, and at a coincidentally critical moment, putting more and highly visible pressure on existing social and political fissures. If the Ohio had not frozen semi-regularly in the decade before the Civil War, would we have had the Margaret Garner case that so infuriated and ignited abolitionists? Would we have had an Uncle Tom's Cabin that could capture the popular imagination? Would we have had such wear and tear on border region politics? Was the human and non-human ecology of the Ohio River Valley party to the Civil War? In raising these questions that may feel like a stretch, I'm leaning on the work of environmental historian Mark Fiji, who asserts in his book, The Republic of Nature, quote, "Within every famous icon, turning point, movement, or moment, is a story of people struggling with the earthy, organic substances that are integral to the human predicament, end quote. At the very least, recognizing that enslaved people knew and used waterways purposefully allows us a finer-grained understanding of their experiences and their resistance strategies. So I'm moving now into my second example, and this will actually be shorter than the first example. And I'm shifting away from the Midwest and the border south to the coastal southeast. I'm going to begin by describing an event and then relate it to those stories that I mentioned earlier, the flying African tales. On Skidaway Island, outside of Savannah, Georgia, a ship docked in May of 1803. This vessel was loaded with souls collected from the west coast of Africa. Many of the people on board were of the Ibo nation. Brokers working on behalf of planters John Cooper and Thomas Spalding purchased a group of these newly arrived people and put them on another ship en route to St. Simon's Island. The ship would travel along a very deep interior waterway, now called Dunbar Creek. And this waterway allowed the passage of ships very easily in between the sea islands and the mainland. Near the bank of this creek, the captured Ibos rebelled, capsizing the ship. A terrified overseer, along with 2 sailors, died while trying to swim away. The Ibos leapt off the ship, sinking into the waters at a place that is now called Ibo Landing, which is on Dunbar Creek, on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. The assessment of this event, put forward by a white witness at the time, was that the Ibos purposefully took their own lives because they could not bear feeling caught up in claustrophobic circumstances on the ship, and they panicked. That witness, named William Mean, was a local slave trader who penned a letter to a plantation owner named Pierce Butler, but bluntly recounting the moment. Mean wrote, quote, "Spalding and Cooper bought a whole cargo of Ibos. The Negroes rose by being confined in a small vessel. The Negroes took to the marsh," end quote. Mean's letter also sympathetically details the death of the overseer, who he describes as a poor fellow, who had been, quote, "frightened, and when swimming ashore, he with 2 sailors were drowned." When turning to a description of the lost African lives, Mean's words take on a pecuniary cast. He says, "The investors in this cargo had, quote, lost at least 10 or 12, recovering them besides, being subject to an expense of $10 a head for salvage," end quote. So in the slave trader's view, the financial cost of retrieving cadavers from the water was the important point to be reckoned with and shared. This expensive outcome could have been avoided, Mean implies in his missive, if it were not for the, quote, mismanagement of Mr. Cooper's overseer. He becomes a tragic persona in his telling. A participant in the slave trade, Mean did not see this event as a human tragedy for the Africans or as an act of resistance that carried political resonances. He saw it instead as a desperate reaction that cut into the bottom line. Now, this specific event in Georgia, an Ibo uprising on St. Simon's Island, may have sparked a suite of stories known as the Flying African Tales. And at the end of these tales, the Ibos, instead of drowning, fly back home to Africa. Although there is no clear evidence that a single event marks the origins of these tales, scholars have posited the link, and it is apparent that formerly enslaved people's own stories about magical flight and their own stories about the Ibo uprising overlap. Lore about the men and women who flew back to Africa from the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas during the period of chattel slavery was handed down orally across generations of residents, often described as Gullah Geechees, and more recently termed Low Country Creoles by the historian Etta Fields Black. The stories that emerge from these communities, and perhaps the particular waterways of and near Dunbar Creek, have become a rich source of collective identity and meaning. Found primarily in Georgia records, the flying motif is recognized across regions and has yielded stunning works of African American art, including, again, Toni Morrison's novel, Song of Solomon, different one this time though, Holly Marshall's novel, Praise Song for the Widow, Virginia Hamilton's children's book, The People Who Could Fly, Julie Dash's film, Daughters of the Dust, and Carrie Mae Weems's photographs in the Sea Island series. Tales of the Flying Africans come down to us in the main through the narratives of ex-slaves on the southeastern coastline. 23 reports of flying Africans appear in the interviews of the state-based Georgia Writers Project. Now, this is a problematic source, which was compiled when local interviewers, many of them white, asked leading and biased questions of African Americans formerly enslaved living on the coast. These interviews were collected in a volume called Drums and Shadows, which is written all in dialect. The interviewers were seeking to preserve, in their view, remnants of an exotic past, and were especially interested in folk practices, such as drumming and the fashioning of charms. They asked about these things, and superstitious beliefs, such as visions of ghosts and witches. They asked about those things. They weren't interested in too much else, and so that means that this collection is limited. However, this is the only place where we have primary accounts about the flying African tales, and so it becomes important nevertheless. You'll hear me quoting from that collection in the next part of the presentation, but I'm not going to quote to you in dialect. I've kind of changed the language. The flying African accounts, as retold by formerly enslaved people in Georgia, offer testimony, often 2 to 3 generations removed, about the ability of an oppressed people who had been seized from their homelands to resist the physical and psychological brutality of bondage. By accessing forms of magic hidden to their slaveholder captors, the protagonists of these stories flew like birds over the Atlantic Ocean back to the places of their births. One formerly enslaved man, Thomas Smith, credited the original homeland as the source of this secret power, citing events from the book of Exodus in the Bible as evidence that, quote, Africa was a land of magic power since the beginning of history, and asserting that this power was transportable across the Middle Passage. Well, then, he continued, the descendants of Africans have the same gift to do unnatural things. I've heard the story of the flying Africans, and I sure believe it happened, end quote. As religious studies scholar Timothy Powell has explained, these flight tales are narratives of transformation that reshape, quote, the hardships of slavery into the magical powers of freedom, end quote. Significant to our topic, waterways figured in these stories as special places for the activation of these magical powers. The fine African tales are evidence of a collective resistant spirit that relies on spirituality as well as features of the natural world for its enactment. They are also evidence of a living oral tradition that took on varying emphases in the voices of multiple tellers to reflect the changing moments and circumstances of slavery. Across the different versions of this tale, interviewees often indicate that they had been told the story at an earlier point in their lives by an eyewitness who'd been born in Africa. So those relating the story to interviewers had not seen people fly themselves. They had heard about people flying, and they attributed this skill, this power to African-born individuals. Jack Wilson, one of the interviewees, stated, quote, some had magic power which came to them from way back in Africa. If they believed in this magic, they could escape and fly back to Africa. James Moore said, quote, "They say the people brought from Africa in slavery times could disappear and fly right back to Africa. From the things I see myself, I believe that they could do this." In a little bit longer example, Mose Brown reported that, quote, "My gran used to tell me about folks flying back to Africa. A man and his wife brought from Africa. When they found out they were slaves and got treated so hard, they just fretted and fretted. One day they were standing with some other slaves, and all of a sudden they said, 'We're going back to Africa, so goodbye, goodbye.' Then they flew right out of sight." And next I'm going to read to you one of the longest descriptions of flying Africans that I found in this record, and this was told by Shad Hall. He's describing an act of flight in response to a threatened punishment. He said, "Those folks could fly too. Their master was fixing to tie them up to whip them. They said, 'Master, you ain't gonna lick me,' and with that they ran down to the river. The overseer, he sure thought he'd catch them when they got to that river, but before he could get them, they rose up in the air and flew away. They flew right back to Africa." In Hall's rendition, the river was a meaningful destination for the Africans, who had to reach that particular spot on the landscape before they were able to take flight. Another formerly enslaved Georgia resident, Floyd White, narrated the Ibo Landing event as a failed attempt at flight that nevertheless highlighted the river as a special place. Floyd White said, "Heard about the Ibo's Landing? That's the place where they brought the Ibo over in a slave ship, and when they got there, they didn't like it, so they all started singing, and they marched right down in the river to march back to Africa. But they weren't able to get there. They drowned." The marching motion that Floyd White describes, as historian Michael Gomez has pointed out in his examination of South Carolina flying African accounts, has similarities to the ring shout, a religious ritual among enslaved blacks that was believed to open communication with the ancestors. In these stories, water is an essential element in black resistance and metaphysical transformation. The storytellers use water as a bridge to freedom, which circles us back to the ice bridge in the Margaret Garner story. Scholars have seized on these formerly enslaved people's accounts of the Ibo Landing uprising to think about alternative consciousness and the strength of enslaved people during a period of intense trauma. According to this view, the Ibos consciously resisted their enslavement, seeing suicide as preferable to lives of bondage. Embedded in their action of walking into the water was the West African-based cultural belief that by drowning, they could transport themselves spiritually, thereby flying back to their homeland. Michael Gomez, again, has explained this interpretation, noting as a matter of context that planters tended to avoid Ibo slaves, stereotyping them as suicidal. In an analysis of Ibo cultural beliefs about death, burial, and suicide in Africa, Gomez concludes that, quote, "For the Ibo then, suicide was perhaps the ultimate form of resistance, as it contained within it the seed for regeneration and renewal. The story of Ibo Landing is an attempt to convey this message that something more profound than simple suicide had taken place," end quote. Taken as a whole, the suite of flying African stories told by former bondspeople on the southeast coast positions the Ibo Landing event, as well as other conflicts between enslaver and slave, as moments that defied reason, as moments during which the oppressed could refuse and be transported. These tales of transcendence through flight and escape emerged from a fluid landscape and might only have been imaginable in such an environment. Water represented power and possibility, motion and magic to the enslaved and to their descendants. Flying African and Ibo Landing stories, told by Low-Country Creoles, evoke the water as a place of spiritual power that serves as a fluid launchpad for flight. As Shad Hall put it, they ran down to the river. The overseer, he sure thought he'd catch them when they got to the river, but before he could get them, they rose up in the air and flew away. From the deep waters of Dunbar Creek emerged a deep well of stories, not only about slavery, but also about the natural world. Those stories tell us that the waterways meandering through the lives of marginalized people help them access powers of transformation for fighting the system of chattel bondage. The weight of water in the African American experience of the coastal Southeast ripples into wider domains of Black Southern life, including recurring religious references to the River Jordan as a locus of spiritual crossing, as well as a long tradition of communal water baptism in rivers and creeks. The reverence for water in African American religious traditions may echo, Michael Gomez says, Yoruba, Fon, and Akan affinities for water, and the Bakongo spiritual belief that ancestors dwelled in a world underneath the waters. As silent witness to Black oppression and resistance, and as a place of transformation and final rest, water has played a consequential role. Contests over oppression and the refusal to be dehumanized were also waged through water. Euro-American slaveholders constructed an entrenched system of bondage along the fertile coasts and sodden, snake-infested rice fields of the Low Country, imprinting memories of trauma onto the lives of the enslaved against the backdrops of water-rich landscapes. Among many other strategies of noncompliance to their objectification, African Americans created an imaginative story world that enlisted water as an enabler of their survival. Through the foregoing examples of the frozen Ohio that Margaret Garner crossed, and the coastal waterways where enslaved Ibos soared on the wings of their spirits, I suggest that the experiences and indeed histories of slavery and resistance should exist in a larger interpretive ecology that centrally includes the natural world. I encourage us to see nature and its elements as more than backdrops where human things happened, but rather as features, forces, and players in those happenings, and as living, changing entities with which enslaved people entered into complex relationship. Bondspeople held a critical awareness of their environments that we have perhaps overlooked while laboring over the decades to research and write their histories. That awareness was not just practical, but also cultural, seeping into the seedbed of African America's most powerful storytelling. So beyond gaining a sense of enslaved people's multifaceted existences and a wider view of their modes of psychological and physical refusals to be slaves, what does seeing the rivers and knowing the rivers through an African American ecocultural lens show us? I have two thoughts on this, nascent thoughts. First, nature was a force to be reckoned with and a source of leverage in individual and organized resistance struggles. Perhaps through considering the role of nature in the context of slavery and abolition, we'll discover something about how to employ awareness of nature in the fight against unjust, intrusive, and totalizing power today. And second, we enter a condition in our time of having degraded most of the planet, leaving us to dwell in what legal historian Jedediah Purdy has called a post-natural world. Enslaved people encountered and intimately interacted with a similarly ravaged plantation landscape. They, in fact, participated in this damage as the exploited labor force that was compelled to clear woods, tend rice, pick cotton, and harvest tobacco on victimized, eroding soils. Black bodies, backs bent, broke this land, and then turned to that very nature for what Frances Harper describes in her poem about Margaret Garner as, quote, a hope of deliverance. Enslaved African Americans were a ransacked people surviving on a ransacked earth. Perhaps if we study their example, we can better arrive at what Purdy has called an aesthetics of damage, sifting out ways to live with grace and with democratic collectivity, with human beings and other creatures on this traumatized Black and blue planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tiya, for that last point is powerful and palpable. In fact, as many of you will know, Jedediah Purdy was the second speaker in our series, actually, so we're seeing some nice continuity through things. So what we'll do, that's wonderful, thank you. What we'll do now is to open the floor for questions. I will field the questions, so catch my eye if you have a question or a query for Tiya, and I'll move us along. I ask that you do us all a favor and let us know who you are when you ask your question. So perhaps your relationship to this work in particular, or just where you're from, one way or the other. So without further ado, thank you, and let's open the floor for questions. I'll kick things off. One thing that strikes me about environmental knowledge is it's highly personal, idiosyncratic, and it's uneven. And so I wanted to ask you to think through, this is very distant from my field. I do modern Japanese history. I write a little bit about animals, a little bit about agriculture, but mostly lately large-scale infrastructure projects, such as electricity grids and so on. But even there, we find the expression of power, meaning political power, not energetic power, although they're of course related, manifest very unevenly through different modes of knowing and understanding the natural world. And so I can imagine myself in one way or another with my limited knowledge and imagination on the ground in these places, in this ravaged landscape that you so eloquently described and brought the talk to an end on. And where were the sources of knowledge and in particular the distinct regimes of knowledge within that culture and of that landscape? Where was the edge of knowledge? For some, how did it work differently for others? I just wanted to ask you to take us into that world a little bit. Mm-hmm. How did people know that ravaged land, or what was beyond it, I suppose?
I've been thinking about this and kind of asking myself why I think enslaved people would have a particular kind of awareness that we haven't thought of perhaps as much as we could, or that the people who claim to own them might not have had. And where I landed with my thinking, which will be just sort of the bottom step of my answer to your question, is that people who are living in a survival state have to be much more aware of what goes into the making of their survival. And that people who live closest to sources in the natural world, in this case by duress, have to be more aware of what those sources are and how they work. So at a very basic level, people at the lowest rung of society, whose forced job it is to prop up everyone else, have to have cultivated a more detailed, kind of more nuanced and even more applied knowledge of all the material things that go into making that world than those who were more privileged. But within that, of course, there would have been differences. So in the Robert Garner story, one thing that Nikki Taylor points out in her book is that Robert Garner, he was a man, he traveled, his owner sent him to Cincinnati to do things. That mobility would have given him a broader picture of what that environment looked like, and would have led him to have different kinds of points of focus, different kinds of skills than perhaps Margaret Garner would have had, or than his mother would have had. So gender would have played a major role. The kinds of labor people did would have played a major role, and so on.
Informing the sense of possibilities, what might have lied beyond. You know, if an edge is familiar, you've spent time thinking about what's beyond it. I had not thought about the gender component clearly in that regard. So let's come here in the front, please.
Hi, thank you, Tiya. My name is Trina, and I live and work in Boston, and I do organizing work and social justice work, and I've worked for some environmental justice organizations, and I feel very connected to the issue. But my response is that I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and so I remember as a child in the 70s when the river froze, and I just remember, I guess my grandmother may have told stories about that history. I didn't even retain any of that, and it makes me wonder, it makes me want to go home and call my mom and ask her about that. But I guess my question is, if I had a question, if I could articulate one, is if you could talk about how this resonates with Black people's relationship to land right now. And I do a lot of work with youth and in Black communities, and our relationship to nature and to land and even waterways are still very fractured and still very ruptured. And our spiritual and psychological and emotional connection is also ruptured too. So I would ask you to, if you can talk about how that resonates with what's happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I think you put it beautifully. And I think you articulated my answer in the question. My thought on that is that there's sort of a contradictory relationship to the land. That on the one hand, we may have these positive memories of being down south, working the land. At the same time, those memories are overshadowed by economic deprivation and duress, and the feeling that getting away from rural areas was moving on to a better kind of life. So when we think about urban farming, this is one of those issues that must have those multiple valences wrapped up within it. On the one hand, people are perhaps excited to turn vacant lots into community gardens and about all the bounty that can bring to a community, both emotional and in terms of health. But also, many of these folks, generations ago, they wanted to leave that behind. And so what does it mean that we're saying your future looks like being a farmer again? I also think that when I say we, I'm talking about African Americans, speaking overly broadly, so please forgive me for that. But I think that we sort of function with stereotypes that might have a little bit of reality in them about distance from outside, distance from nature. I definitely have found that in my project, Eco Girls, where when we sometimes take some of the girls in our program to various places in northern Michigan, that they didn't really identify with being a part of their state or part of the place where they lived, and their reaction is, I'm afraid of the dark, I'm afraid of bugs, and I don't want to get close to fish, and a real sense of distance. But not many generations ago, their grandparents would have known how to fish and known how to do things outside. So I think there's a lot of contradiction and tension in that relationship, but that we can keep working on it.
I have a number of questions. We'll come first to Emmanuel, then to the middle here, and I recognize you up here on the left too.
Thank you, Tiya, for just a wonderful talk. I have two specific thoughts, and perhaps they are more thoughts than questions, about ways in which perhaps some of the things you've explored can be connected to other things. In terms of, I'm an Akan from West Africa, so I understand the reverence for water. Most of the important deities among the Asante are connected to rivers. The mother of all deities, the sea, and I can go on and on. But so in terms of the origins of these stories about Ibo Landing, I can see the West African influence. What I'm wondering is about the retelling of these stories over generations, and perhaps the possible interface with Christian influences. Yeah. In the Old Testament, the connection between rivers, exile, spiritual homeland, clear. Jews in exile, they gather around rivers. So that is one thought. And then the second, in the last decade or two, West African archaeologists have become very interested in what they call conflict landscapes. And they've been looking in particular at landscapes of slavery, both in terms of land, but also even in terms of water. So, for example, Ganvier Lake in Benin, and the work of the archaeologist J. Cameron Monroe, and things like that. And I think there might be important insights from this. I look at your retelling of the Ohio and its peculiar capacity to be both a waterway, and sometimes you're walking on it. And so it's both water and land in very interesting ways, and how you could play with that and some of the insights that come from conflict landscapes.
Thank you for those comments. I agree with you on your perspective that Christian influence is a part of what's going on with the connection to water, most definitely, and that it all gets kind of mixed up in the way the stories come out. There's one example that I read where the interviewee is citing the Bible for information about Africa. I think that's a clear example of exactly what you're talking about. And I really like this term, conflict landscapes. I think that's a helpful category to think with. Thank you.
We'll come here to the center, and there are two questions right next to one another. And then,
thank you so much for that wonderful
tell us
talk.
who you are.
Oh, my name is Ajanta Subramanian. I am an anthropologist, and much of my work has been on nature and the politics around nature. So Linda Nash, who's an environmental historian, has this really wonderful, extremely short and useful essay, which is titled The Agency of Nature, or the Nature of Agency. And in it, she basically says that what environmental historians can really do is not to add nature to the already sort of voluminous set of actors that we work with, but rather it's to question the nature of agency, right? So it's not to render nature yet another agent, but it's to question what agency is. And she says, typically we're accustomed to thinking about the human actor in terms of this sort of seamless flow from conception to intention to action to outcome. And what gets left out is how environmentally embedded all of this is, and right? So how landscapes, how the material world constitutes every part of that sequence, right? From conception all the way to outcome. And when I was listening to your talk, I mean, it sort of struck me that in a way, every action that you narrated, of resistance on the part of the enslaved was about conception, intention, action, and outcome, except that the river was conscripted, right, as part of the plot, right? So I wonder, and I was also struck when you were talking about your own relationship to the Ohio River, whose banks you lived on, and you obviously interacted with on a daily basis, you said, I didn't know the river. And, you know, I think in some ways that's precisely the point, is that one doesn't have to be conscious, right, of how the material world shapes us, but it does, right? So I wonder if there's a way of thinking about the relationship between human beings and nature, not solely in terms of sort of a conscious knowledge, which you can then mobilize for particular ends, but also of a kind of unconscious, everyday influence, right? Which permeates everything. So, yeah, I wonder if, and you know, you didn't give us any examples of just the everydayness of the interaction between the enslaved and the natural environment, right? It was much more of about these sort of conscious acts of resistance, right? So that might be an interesting way of sort of paying heed to Linda Nash's caution, that the point is not to simply add nature as another actor, but to sort of rethink agency altogether.
I appreciate that. So it sounds as if the Linda Nash article is about 5 steps ahead of where I am in my thinking, because right now, just to see these events in a different kind of frame is pushing the way that I kind of interpret them. But what you're asking about everyday life is something that I think that, well, it's at least been approached in a book on the Wormslow plantation by a historian named Drew Swanson, who was trying to look at the environmental history of this plantation. And he starts it by looking at Native people. This is in Georgia, outside of Savannah, in the area. And then he talks a lot about food. He talks a lot about subsistence practices and the kinds of things that grow in the wild, the kinds of animals that live there, the ways that people who live there were able to kind of access these animals or plants, how they prepared them. And his major point there is about the cultural interaction and exchange through especially enslaved black cooks using the elements of nature that they're most familiar with cooking for themselves and mixing that up with the menu that the person who owns them gives them and says they want this to be prepared. So I think that foodways may be a way to kind of get at this everyday aspect that you're talking about. In terms of what's unconscious, oh goodness, I don't know how to get at that. I mean, literature can help us to get to that. I often feel, especially in working with this material, the whole category of spirituality is you know, kind of probably dripping all through this. I don't quite know what to do with it, because I feel that there may be a line that I should maintain, or people would want to see maintained, between an attempt at environmental history, which this is not quite, I recognize that, and also thinking about nature in a way that's starting to feel spiritual and maybe kind of loosey-goosey. So I find it very interesting, that question about unconscious experiences and relationships. I think they exist. I don't quite know how we would get at them.
I mean, I don't mean to, I'm not meaning to render it psychological, but just that there are forms of embodied practice, right, which are environmentally embedded, which may not be sort of articulated as such, right, but they're obviously profoundly constitutive of how people live, how they relate to one another, you know, and also how they plot their escapes, right? And that scale of just everyday practice, I think is actually a sort of a perfect repertoire to get at environmentally embedded subjectivity, you know.
Hi, so I'm Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, in History and African American Studies at Harvard. But I do want to push you a little bit on the spiritual side of thinking environmentally, because waters and rivers have that meaning for almost every group, I would think. And they have both a profoundly restorative and therefore life-giving role that they play with vegetation around them. And they also have a death identity to them. Not just simply that people drown in the rivers, but rains come down and the rivers overflow. And I'm thinking about, for example, the case of Prosser's Gabriel, that revolt that he tried when those rains came and those bridges collapsed, and those images are both images of life and death, and they're so deeply rooted in a. I mean, we know them from a Judeo-Christian identity, most of us, but I'm sure this will be in many, many religions. But just the idea of baptism. And many black people, especially during this time, and even into the early 20th century, literally baptized in rivers. I wrote a history of a church in Washington, D.C., where a woman talks about how they were cracked the ice to baptize in Rock Creek, the park, Rock Creek Park, but the creek. But the idea that these rivers, when you go down into the water, that is death. And then when you come up out of the water, that is life. But that tension, that constant between life and death, is very much a part of, I think, the understanding of these slaves. I can think of an image, and I'm sure Vince knows this image, of this gravesite where the canoe it's a canoe there, and it's covered with, it's a slave gravesite. And the grave is a canoe, and it's got shells over it, and obviously it's got something to do with both death and life. I just think those two things. The last thing I want to tell you is I just wrote something, in fact, for an interview that I did with the National Park Service, and one of the points that I made was an experience that I had when I went to Grand Canyon, and then that same experience that came back to me reading Du Bois. Read Du Bois's Dark Water. Now, when he talks about flying over the Grand Canyon, and he looks down and he can see the Colorado River, and the way he talks about the Colorado River is in this both life-giving and death-giving, and he even has a chapter a little later on of beauty and death. But the way he sees that river as both people and as black women and as this fertility, and yet it's so far away and it's meandering in this rocky, death-like canyon of a world turned upside down, as he describes it. I mean, it's just really beautiful. I do think that those ideas of death and life, there's something going on with the slaves, but I do think also that it's not unique just to black people.
Yeah. I agree with you, and this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, and I thank you for those examples. To what extent is any of this, if not unique, then specific to African American experience, and how far can I push that point? And I think that where I come out on that is that there must be these kinds of understandings across cultural practices in terms of water, for sure. Yes, they are. Yes. So I think that the turn that I'd want to make, given that, is not to say that African Americans are the only ones who thought about water in this way, or enslaved people were the only ones, but instead that we haven't seen African American people as the kind of people to relate to the natural world in these kinds of ways, and that if we kind of shift our lens of where we look for nature or relationship with nature, toward black people, that we'll see something else in black life and black history, black culture, black knowledge that we didn't see before. And that something else can perhaps bring us to other insights, additional insights about culture and politics in different spheres as well. But I absolutely agree with you. It's not just a Black experience.
Although the field of environmental history is remarkably homogeneous and very much focused on a white, largely Western American, but certainly a white American experience. So, young woman up here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Giovanna. I'm a first-year PhD in African American Studies with a primary in History of Art. So I'm thinking a lot about Ntozake Shange's, what is it, Sassafras, I have it, okay, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. And I was reading a paper that really had to do with an eco-criticism of that work and thinking about specifically the role of botanics, of a diaspora memory that is embodied and both embodied and organized by a certain kind of attention to nature, to environment. And so as I was thinking about that in regards to your talk, and there in the freezing of the river, I was wondering, what can this idea of freezing, this shift of the water, this change of state, where it's not a drowning that's happening, and even if the ice were to crack and you fall, you might die from being frozen before drowning. I mean, I don't know. This hasn't happened to me. But I think about, what is the history of slavery, or in the United States, in colder climates, in the North? How can this attention to environment, to freezing as a different state of water, and this is a different set of botanical conditions, a different set of environmental conditions, I think, than the South. I think, what can your reading and essentially your method offer that kind of inquiry?
Thank you for that question. I've been doing some research on slavery in the North, in Detroit in particular, and what I've been able to kind of take note of, to see in that context, has been influenced by these questions. And I think that I am seeing that social landscape differently just by having some of these questions in the back of my head. So slavery develops depending upon the environment and what grows there, what can grow there, what can be developed to turn a profit there. And in the Detroit area, that product is animal pelts, kind of animal furs. And what that difference has led me to think about is the way in which slavery shifts because of that material or physical environment of the stuff that can be grown or gotten or harvested or traded there. So enslaved people in this area had a lot of involvement with the fur trade process. And interestingly to me, were used as carriers of pelts, were thought of, that is, there was an idea, a proposal put forward that they would be used as means to refine pelts, so that Black people who were enslaved doing things like building settlements would be wearing the beaver furs. This was just an idea, a plan, a scheme, didn't go very far, but they'd be wearing the beaver furs. And by wearing those furs and doing their other work, they would kind of rub down the harder furs and make that beaver fur more valuable, because it would then turn into, fat beaver is one term for it, that people would actually find more attractive to purchase. So almost like a double labor that's being stolen from enslaved people in this particular kind of environment. So in terms of method, I think it's pretty rudimentary. For me, it's just about seeing that enslaved people are living in environments that are physical and material. These environments are shaping what their lives look like, how they experience their worlds, and what they can do in those worlds.
Thank you very much. So we'll come here and then back over this way and then ricochet across. So Robin, please introduce yourself, Robin.
Robin Kelsey. Thank you so much, Tiya, for this talk, which for me was personally resonant because I grew up blocks from the Mississippi River, and you were bringing back the memories of the 1970s and those particular winters, so thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the forms of self-transport, which the rivers are providing in these instances, and a transport that doesn't involve going up and down the river. It involves either crossing the ice or being able to take to the sky, whereas the transport up and down the river is an economic transport, a transport associated with the slave trade. And just if you could say more about that, and of course, you know, that I know you're trying to resist the metaphorical, and so I'm moving in a way that could get one to the figurative, but I also would imagine that just in a very elemental way, the river could experientially just carry these meanings and connotations in a way that's not really that metaphorical, but more historical.
Well, on metaphor, I mean, I love it. You know, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and there's so much of it. I mean, there's so much that I'm sure has been written in eco-criticism and or could be written on African-American literature and nature. So I don't want to throw metaphor out. I'm just trying to push myself to not just lean on that, because that's probably where I would want to go first and most comfortably. What you said about up and down the river versus across the river and across the sky, that's exciting to me. I hadn't thought about that in terms of directionality. I think certainly colloquially, down the river is a bad place to go. And when people are talking about these ice bridges, the language is of crossing. And crossing does seem to have connected to it more of a sense of that person acting on her or his own behalf to move across the river, as opposed to down the river is usually described as it's a passive action. Somebody was sold down the river. So I think that's that could be fruitful. In terms of the flying, I haven't heard of flying, you know, connected to a down or an across, but it feels as if flying would be an across kind of motion, right? I mean, in the whole coastal section of stories that I tried to work with, you all probably heard this. You probably heard that it's segmented in many ways, this body of stories. Some of them are about Ibo Landing. Some of them are about flying. A couple of them are about both. A few of them talk about water, but it's all kind of on the water. So that part of the talk is much kind of looser in terms of thinking about what is the pattern that's taking shape here. But I'd be willing to go with the idea that that people are flying, you know, across, and that there's something about crossing that's different than being sent down or going down. I mean, crossing does seem to be a more spiritually inflected way of thinking about some of these different motions. I'll think about that.
Hi, my name is Vicky Hassan, and I'm a filmmaker that's currently working on a project involving Harriet Tubman. And I wanted to come just to see how you would approach this topic. I'm sure you're familiar with her raid on the Combahee River and the use of enslaved Africans, the 100,000 plus that had escaped that horrific institution, using, you know, the moss on the side of the trees and the stars and various herbs and whatever to assist them. And, you know, as I was listening to you, so many things resonated in terms of what you had to say and questions that came out of the audience or comments that came out of the audience. You know, I myself was baptized in a river, you know, and still spend a lot of time with the Charles River on a weekly basis. But, you know, what came to mind was how during the enslavement period, people used the environment as an aid to escape. And now, or rivers as an aid. But now we have Flint, and where the environment is really at odds with the health. Not because it's a natural thing, but I'd like to see what your opinion of that is.
I think it's wonderful that you're working on a film about Harriet Tubman. Yeah, I bet. One of the things that I want to do for this project, and I've just started, is to reread various slave narratives with this lens, you know, as my focus. I started with reading Harriet Jacobs' Instance in the Life of a Slave Girl, and was surprised by how often she mentions elements of nature in that narrative, all different kinds. I mean, you know, trees, woods, swamps, vines, sunlight, and what those things mean to her in her life. I haven't yet read Harriet Tubman's narrative, which is a narrative that she told to Sarah Bradford. But my memory of that narrative is that she does mention these locations, but she doesn't go into detail about the kinds of things that we would want to know most, you know, regarding the moss and the trees, and how she was actually steering through the environment and navigating that. So I suppose my fear would be that Harriet Tubman herself won't give us what we really would want to be able to fill out that full picture of how she used the environment. In terms of nature being an enabler of Black people's escapes in the past, and nature being kind of a detriment to Black people today, you know, in cities. It's not just nature, though; it's also related to government and powers. You know, as Ian was saying earlier, I find that. Say that again. That's right. That's right. I think that it's maybe a little tempting to see it in that way. But when I go back and look at some of these narratives, what I see is enslaved people relating to nature as an enabler and also as a threat and as an element that can trap them. So I was recently looking at John Brown's narrative, which is about Georgia and some other places. A lot of it's in Georgia. And he talks about how his mistress, you know, the woman who owns him and the other Black children, would have them come every morning and get some kind of medicinal herb from her. And then she'd have them run around this tree and tell them she was getting them ready for market. So in that kind of an example, that relationship to nature would not be a positive one, I don't think, one in which nature is an enabler. Their nature is representing the threat of separation from one's family. So I think that it's, when we take a close look, it's going to be functioning in both ways, and then we're going to have to try to tease out all those complexities.
That's fascinating. And I'm really curious over the course of the discussion to take nature apart in the ways that you've been suggesting. That is, the animal is quite distinct from various waters. Water works differently in a swamp, as you suggest in one of the narratives, as opposed to a river that flows and moves. And really using those narratives to read that landscape is fascinating. We have a question here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was very moving. My name is Evan Lea Espiritu. I'm a visiting grad student from UC Berkeley in the Department of Rhetoric. And I want to pick up on this idea in your answer about the environment in the river as not only an enabler but also a threat in some ways, and so the double position there. I was really struck by your comments at the end of the talk in the ways that enslaved peoples also ravaged the land and ransacked the land, and even if though that was through structures of exploitation, that they were still put in the position to do that and positioned in relation to the land in that way. And so it made me think about the way that the environment can also hold on to that pain, right? Maybe not in a conscious way or in a agential way, but the way that it is structured into land. So I was very struck, for example, by the Garner's relationship to the Mississippi River, right? And this was a case in which the river did not comply. It was not, a co-conspirator into the passage to freedom, but rather, not that the river took revenge, but rather that the river maybe held on to that pain that these enslaved peoples had enacted onto the land in some way. And so that, I don't know if it's a joining in the pain, or in ways that the river took hold. But I was just wondering if you had any comments or thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a beautiful reflection and comment. And one part of me feels that, yes, this must be the case, that the land holds on to that pain. But maybe I should say, and I think that the way to explore that would be, again, through studies of creative writing, or the production of creative writing, or spirituality. It would be hard to, I think, try to approach that kind of question in a history unless pain could be translated into physical manifestation of damage. And then I think that you could see that in the landscape that enslaved people have worked in those damaged soils that I kind of alluded to in the last parts of my comment.
So I've seen a variety of hands up. I want to ask, if you have a question, signal, and we're going to take at least two, and Tiya, I'll allow you to respond to them. We'll take them in series. Start here and then come over here. And just please, if you could both offer your question for Tiya, and then we'll allow her to respond to both as by way of closing.
Hi, I'm Liat Sfiro. I'm a graduate student in the history department. Not to embarrass her, but I recall from Professor Chaplin's first book a quite intense focus on water management in the Lower South. And so I guess I'm wondering if we think about water management under slavery as an anxious pursuit, how that would also relate to questions of sort of knowledge in practice and implicit types of skills, and also, again, sort of technologies of exploitation of different types.
That's a fabulous question. It gets to comparative questions as well via Joyce's work. Yes?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, Tiya. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm Kendra Field. I'm a fellow here at the Warren Center this year. I wanted to ask about how your longstanding work at the intersection of African American and Native American histories has shaped your approach to these questions. And I guess specifically it seems, in Ties That Bind, you write really beautifully about kind of the erasure of African Americans from kind of the historiography of Indian removal and of land displacement, and then the effects on interactions between African Americans and Native Americans. And it seems to me that that you're speaking to a clear and present erasure of African Americans from what should be an obvious and direct through line, right? And on the other hand, you have in Native American studies, a much more visible relation, albeit often romanticized. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that paradox.
Yeah, the ecological Indian debate. Yeah.
Well, thank you for both of those questions. On the water management point, I agree, that would be a whole other way and a fruitful way to think about enslaved people's relationships with environments. I think especially in the ricing area, where those kinds of skills and technologies were forced partnerships between the knowledge of enslaved African people and their owners and overseers, and where that landscape was redone in a really complicated way to allow for ricing to actually take place there. I was recently in South Carolina visiting some plantations. Most of them had been rice plantations, and it was very interesting to hear the tour guides talk about how after the Civil War, these plantations stopped growing rice. They never talked about why, unless they were prompted by me or my husband, actually. And what they came around to saying was that you couldn't get people to actually come do this work for pay. And this related to just how hot and disease-ridden and horrible that labor was. But it's interesting to think about all those different layers of water management and the experience of what it would have been like to work in not just water, but not just swamps, but those ponds, that seepy landscape all the time. Bogs, and I think people give me words, thank you. But also, something that comes to mind about this, which I think is interesting, I'm not quite sure how to tie it in, is that both the sites that I talked about have strange contemporary manifestations. So Dunbar Creek in the area of Ibo Landing is a place where St. Simon's Island does its wastewater treatment. And there's a lot of debate, conflict, discussion going on about the island becoming really more populated than infrastructure can sustain, and wastewater going not where it should, and Dunbar Creek becoming polluted, and the question of how they're going to manage that. So it's an example of a site that, according to this group, I think I put a slide up, it's not there anymore. According to this group that recently went back and tried to commemorate that place, this is a sacred site, but right now it's functioning as sort of a toilet. And that's just interesting, I think, but probably not accidental. I don't mean by that someone came out and said, we're going to take this black site and make it into a waste treatment area, but I mean by that African American sites are often forgotten. I remember reading too in Stephen Weisenberger's book, which was published a while ago, I'm not sure what the current state is, that the home of the Kite family, where the Garners first went when they crossed the river, it doesn't exist anymore, and it's also a wastewater treatment facility in Cincinnati. African American and Native American relations to lands and how we think about them. Yeah, Kendra, I mean, I agree with what was embedded in your question, which is that Native Americans have too often been associated with land and flattened into certain understandings of nature. And African Americans have been sort of stripped from land. And I think part of the reason for that is that these understandings serve our narratives about Native people, Black people, and the United States. So one thing that I find pretty interesting as a way to think about this is a comment that was made by Vine Deloria Jr. in one of his books. This is the one, We Talk, You Listen. And he says in that book that Black people were kind of made into pets, whereas Native people were kind of treated as wild animals. If you carry that thinking out, I think it sort of makes sense that Native people are associated with wild landscapes as a place where they belong, and the Black people have been kind of severed from those landscapes in many ways in our imaginations.
Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking Tiya for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.